and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. And first and foremost, I would like to thank those countries who conducted themselves and deemed it possible to vote against or abstain against the proposal of the US to discuss this topic today. One might have the impression that Russia is scared of discussing the situation regarding Ukraine and therefore put forward this procedural vote. Russia is not refusing to discuss the situation in Ukraine, but we just don't understand what we are discussing here today and why we are indeed here today. As I already said, on the 17th of February, we are planning to hold a meeting during our presidency of the 7th anniversary of the implementation of the Minsk agreements, where we are able to talk about this situation with regarding Ukrainian settlement. But today's meeting is not about that at all. Recently, we've been encountering a very unusual, even given today's difficult time situation, a very unusual situation. The deployment of Russian troops within our own territory has frequently occurred on varying scales before and has not caused any hysterics whatsoever. Troops and servicemen who are in their own areas of deployment and barracks where they were before, and they are where they were before, are not actually on the border. So this deployment of Russian troops in our own territory is getting our Western and US colleagues to say that there's going to be a planned military action and even an act of aggression. But the USPR said as if that act of aggression has already taken place. I very carefully listened to her statement. The military action of Russia against Ukraine that they're all assuring us is going to take place in just a few weeks' time, if not a few days' time. There, however, is no proof confirming such a serious accusation whatsoever being put forward. However, it is not preventing people from whipping up hysteria to such an extent that an actual economic impact is already being felt by our Ukrainian neighbors. Our Western colleagues are talking about the need for de-escalation. However, first and foremost, they themselves are whipping up tensions and rhetoric and are provoking escalation. The discussions about a threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You are almost calling for this. You want it to happen. You're waiting for it to happen, as if you want to make your words become a reality. This is despite the fact that we are constantly rejecting these allegations. And this is despite the fact that no threat of a planned invasion into Ukraine from the lips of any Russian politician or public figure over all of this period has been made. No such threat has been made. Rather, at all levels, we've been categorically rejecting such plans. And we're going to do this right now. Everybody who claims the opposite is misleading you. If our Western colleagues who provoked and supported the 2014 bloody anti-constitutional coup, bringing to power in Kiev nationalists, radicals, Russophobes, and pure fascists, Nazis rather, if they'd not done this, then we to date would be living in a spirit of good neighborly relations and mutual cooperation. However, some in the West just don't clearly like this positive scenario. What's happening today is yet another attempt to drive a wedge between Russia and Ukraine. Thanks to their geopolitical games, our colleagues have been suffering for some 7 years now. The Ukrainians are actively being brainwashed. They're cultivated with Russophobia and radical thinking, leading to the belief that for Ukraine to have a bright future, it mustn't establish relations with its neighbors, but rather at any cost strive to join the EU and NATO. They are banning Russian, which is a native language for a significant, if not the majority, of people in Ukraine. They are causing an Orthodox split, church split, or divide. They are making heroes out of those people who fought on the side of Hitler, who destroyed Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians. The interests of the Ukrainian people in this destructive game is something that our Western colleagues are not taking into consideration. Their aim is to prevent the natural brotherly coexistence of our two people, brotherly peoples, peoples and countries, rather, which would destroy their plans to weaken Russia and would create an arc of instability around it. There's nothing that we're seeing that's new here in the same spirit of divide and conquer, the divide and rule. This same spirit was characteristic for Western powers, or Western states rather, earlier. It's also noteworthy that our American colleagues artificially are getting involved in the sham tension that they themselves created on the Russian-Ukrainian border. There was the negotiation process pushed forward by ourselves to ensure for Russia legally binding security guarantees. They deliberately are creating the impression that Moscow apparently is specifically or on purpose stirring up tension that means that it can be more accessible for the US and NATO. If you look at the timetable for the negotiation process, you'll see that such considerations are fundamentally untrue. The situation, in fact, is completely the opposite. Our Western colleagues are trying on the wave of, on the top of this wave of hysteria to boil our dialogue solely down to so-called settlement of the situation on the border with Ukraine. Our security demands are much broader: the non-accession of Ukraine to NATO, the non-deployment in its territory of foreign troops. All of this is just one part of the agreements that could fundamentally improve the military political situation in Europe and for the world as a whole. And this type of agreement is something that we talked about in the Astana, Istanbul, and OSCE summits, where apart from the freedom to choose one's allies or alliances, was also the stipulation that the security guarantees of some states should not be carried out to the detriment of the security of other states. Since our American colleagues convened us today, let them show us any evidence apart from bogus narratives that Russia is intending to attack Ukraine. In the statement of my American colleague, there was a significant hodgepodge of accusations of aggressive actions by Russia, but no specific fact given. Incidentally, I'd like to put a question not only to our US colleague, but also to those who said, where did you get the figure of 100,000 troops that are deployed, as you state, on the Russian-Ukrainian border? Although that is not the case. We have never cited that figure. We've never confirmed that figure. We do recall this, and we recall this since Secretary of State Colin Powell in this very room waved around a vial with an unidentified substance as so-called evidence of the presence of WMDs in Iraq. They didn't find any weapons, but what happened with that country is well known to one and all. Ukraine, as well, is a country, it seems, that our colleagues are prepared to sacrifice for their own pernicious interests. Otherwise, it's hard to explain why, in convening us today, the initiators of this meeting did not even heed the opinion of the president of Ukraine, who asked the West not to whip up panic, which has already had a harmful impact on the economic situation in the country. Otherwise, it's difficult to explain why our colleagues from the US and a number of other countries are actively pumping Ukraine full of weapons and ammunition, and talk about this with great pride, moreover. The weapons that it would readily use against civilians in the east of its own country. And all this is being done in violation of the Minsk agreements approved by the UN Security Council as the only basis for a peaceful settlement of the internal Ukrainian conflict. Incidentally, to my American colleague, well, she mentioned the fact that 14,000 people have died in the conflict. I would recommend that she reads the report of the Special Monitoring Mission of the OSCE and look at what side, how many people died on each side out of these 14,000. Most of these people are civilians in Donbass who died from shelling from the Ukrainian armed forces. Madam President, the maneuvers of the US regarding the convening of this meeting is particularly hypocritical because it was the Americans who hold the record for having troop presences outside their territory. American troops, advisors, and weapons, including nuclear weapons, are frequently deployed thousands of kilometers from Washington. I'm not even talking about the fact that the military adventures of the US have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians of countries, of places where they were supposed to be bringing peace and democracy. The US consistently, including over recent years, has used force against other states without the authorization of the UN Security Council. In their arsenal, unilateral sanctions and coercive measures, threats of implementing it. It seems to be like the ruling of some kind of Supreme Court that they want to impose this upon enemy. For example, many countries of the UN have been subject to aggression or attacks by the US, and 191 countries of the Security Council have seen American troops deployed there. There is data available on the internet stating that there are 750 US bases in more than 80 countries of the world. The overall number are deployed abroad of US troops. This is 175,000 troops are deployed abroad. 175,000. And more than 60,000 troops are deployed in Europe. The volume of the US military budget was $700 million. 778, rather. So Russia's budget was 12 times lower. So these examples are pose a specific threat to international peace and security, and they're clear examples of this. As regards the calls to settle the crisis regarding Ukraine, we wholeheartedly clapping for this. But this crisis just has one dimension. It's a domestic Ukrainian crisis. And changing the situation, improving it, can only be done through Kiev implementing the already mentioned Minsk agreements that stipulate primarily direct dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk. There is no other option if our Western partners push Kiev to sabotage the Minsk agreements, something that Ukraine is that they're willingly they're willingly doing, then that might end in the absolute worst way for Ukraine, and not because somebody has destroyed it, but because it would have destroyed itself. And Russia has absolutely nothing to do with this. Don't try to shift the blame onto somebody else. And we are going, incidentally, to talk about all of this in detail on the 17th of February during the long-planned annual UN Security Council meeting on the implementation of Resolution 2202. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I give the